August 6, 1944, 27,000 feet above Hamburg, Germany. The morning sun glints off aluminum as 300 B-17 flying fortresses drone toward their target through flak-darkened skies. Below them, escorting the bomber stream, Major George Preddy sits in the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang, Cripes A Mighty Third, scanning the horizon with the practiced intensity of a man who's already sent 20 enemy fighters to their graves. Preparing and narrating this type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. Then he sees them. 30-plus Messerschmitt Bf-109s, black crosses sharp against scattered clouds, forming up for their attack run on the bombers. The German pilots haven't spotted the American fighters yet, still climbing into position, confident in their numbers and altitude advantage. It's the kind of tactical mistake that gets men killed. Preddy's radio crackles. He's leading the 487th Fighter Squadron today, 12 Mustangs against odds that would make most men hesitate. But George Preddy doesn't hesitate. He never has. The 25-year-old from Greensboro, North Carolina, who worked in a cotton mill to pay his way through community college, who got rejected by the Navy 3 times for being too small, too curved in the spine, too high in blood pressure, has something to prove that's written in gunpowder and victory crosses painted on aluminum. Tally-ho, he calls, then pushes his throttle forward and dives. What happens in the next 12 minutes will become legend. 6 German fighters destroyed, 1 pilot, 1 aircraft. One perfect morning where everything that training, experience, and raw talent can produce aligns into something the Luftwaffe won't forget, and the 8th Air Force won't believe until they see the gun camera footage. But this isn't a story about one mission. This is the story of how a farm state, a kid who barely squeezed into flight school, became the most lethal P-51 pilot the war would ever see, flying the same aircraft through mission after mission, accumulating victories that should have been statistically impossible. And it's the story of how that streak would end not with a German bullet, but with an American one, on Christmas morning, 1944, in the frozen mud of Belgium. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. George Earl Preddy Jr. was born February 5, 1919, in Greensboro, North Carolina, the second of 4 children in a working-class family headed by a Southern Railway employee. This wasn't a household with money to spare. The Great Depression hit Guilford County the same way it hit everywhere else in the South, which is to say brutally. By the time George graduated from Greensboro High School at age 16, having doubled up on courses to finish early, the idea of college seemed like a luxury his family couldn't afford. He went to work at a cotton mill, the kind of grinding, repetitive labor that kills dreams in men who let it. Preddy didn't let it. He saved money, enrolled at Guilford College, and somehow found time to learn to fly. Not through any formal program, not through military channels, but the old-fashioned way, paying an instructor for lessons at a local airfield, trading hours of work for minutes in the cockpit of a biplane that had seen better decades. By 1938, George Preddy was barnstorming, flying county fairs, giving rides for $2 a head, performing stunts for crowds that had never seen an airplane up close. It wasn't glamorous, it paid poorly, but it gave him something more valuable than money, flight hours, and the kind of seat-of-the-pants flying skill you can't learn from a manual. When war clouds started gathering over Europe, Preddy decided to join up. First stop, the US Navy. Naval aviation was prestigious, well-funded. Flying off carriers seemed like the pinnacle of the profession. He walked into the recruiting office in 1940, stood for his physical, and got rejected. Curvature of the spine. 5'9", 125 pounds. High blood pressure. Try again later. He tried again. Rejected. Tried a 3rd time. Rejected again. Most men would have given up. Preddy walked across the street to the Army Air Corps recruiting office and took their physical. Somehow, the Army's doctors saw what the Navy's didn't, or maybe they had lower standards, or maybe by 1941, with war on the horizon, They needed pilots more than they needed perfect specimens. He passed. Then they told him the pilot training classes were full. Come back in 6 months. Preddy had spent his whole life being told no, being told to wait, being told he wasn't quite good enough. He'd developed a specific response to that. He joined the North Carolina National Guard's 252nd Coast Artillery Regiment, kept flying civilian aircraft, and waited for his orders. They came in April 1941. Report to DAR Aerotech in Albany, Georgia, for primary flight training. By December 12, 1941, 5 days after Pearl Harbor turned America's theoretical war into a shooting one, Second Lieutenant George E. Preddy Jr. received his wings at Craig Field, Alabama. The cotton mill worker from Greensboro was now a fighter pilot in the United States Army Air Forces. His first assignment, P-40 Warhawk pilot with the 9th Pursuit Squadron, 49th Pursuit Group. Destination: Darwin, Australia, where the Japanese were making regular bombing runs and American forces were desperately trying to establish defensive positions in the Pacific Theater. This was 1942, when American pilots were still learning their trade against an enemy that had been perfecting theirs for years over, China. Preddy arrived in Darwin in early 1942 and immediately began flying combat patrols in the P-40, a capable aircraft at low altitude but outmatched by Japanese Zeros in a turning fight. He damaged 2 enemy aircraft over Darwin, never quite getting the clean kill that would have made him an ace, always coming close but not quite closing the deal. Then, on July 12, 1942, his war nearly ended before it started. Training flight. 4 P-40s, Preddy and Second Lieutenant Richard Taylor playing the role of Japanese bombers, while First Lieutenant Jack Donaldson and Second Lieutenant John Sauber practiced intercept procedures. Routine stuff, the kind of mission they'd flown dozens of times. Sauber came in for his attack run, probably blinded by the sun, possibly just misjudging distance the way rookie pilots sometimes do. His P-40's propeller chewed into Preddy's tail section at 200 miles per hour. Sauber died in the impact, his aircraft disintegrating around him before he could even process what was happening. Preddy's P-40, tail nearly severed, went into a spin. He was at 2,000 feet when he made the decision to bail out, low enough that mistakes would be fatal, high enough that he might just make it. He went over the side, pulled the ripcord, felt the parachute deploy, and hit the ground hard enough to put him in the hospital for 4 months. During that hospital stay, while broken bones mended and bruises faded, Preddy had time to think about his friend Sauber, about how quickly combat pilots die, and about whether he actually had what it took to survive this war. Some men come out of near-death experiences timid, cautious, afraid to push their luck. George Preddy came out hungry. He'd been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it sitting behind a desk or flying training missions in the rear areas. By December 1942, he was stateside, looking for a combat assignment that would put him back in the fight. That assignment came courtesy of his old squadron mate Jack Donaldson, who recommended him for the 352nd Fighter Group forming up at Mitchell Field, New York. The 352nd was headed to England, to the 8th Air Force, to the daylight bombing campaign that was bleeding bombers and crew at catastrophic rates over occupied Europe. Preddy joined the 487th Fighter Squadron in early 1943, initially flying the P-47 Thunderbolt, a massive, heavily armoured fighter that American pilots called the Jug because it looked like a milk jug with wings. The P-47 was tough, could take incredible punishment and keep flying, but it wasn't particularly nimble, and its rate of climb left something to be desired. Preddy flew it anyway, learning the skies over Europe, learning how the Luftwaffe fought, accumulating experience that would matter later. On June 30th, 1943, the 352nd Fighter Group boarded the troopship Queen Elizabeth and crossed the Atlantic. They were assigned to RAF Bodney in Norfolk, under the operational control of the 67th Fighter Wing, 8th Fighter Command. Preddy flew his first European combat mission in September 1943. By October, he was starting to get kills. December 1st, 1943, he shot down his first Messerschmitt Bf-109 over Germany. The kill report reads like most of them do, clinical, precise, describing deflection angles and range estimations, and the moment when 30 caliber tracers found their mark and the enemy fighter came apart in flames. But behind that clinical language was the accumulation of everything Preddy had learned, the barnstorming instincts, the P-40 experience in Darwin, the hundreds of hours studying how German pilots fought and where they were vulnerable. By early 1944, Preddy was painting victory crosses on his P-47, naming each aircraft Cripes A Mighty, his favourite expression when gambling or when things went sideways in combat. The name stuck. Through 3 different aircraft, through transfers between squadrons, through promotions and decorations, every plane George Preddy flew would carry that name in white letters on dark metal. January 29, 1944, the 352nd Fighter Group escorted 800 bombers returning from Frankfurt. Over the French coast, Preddy spotted a Focke-Wulf FW-190 attacking the bomber stream and dove to intercept. He got the kill, his guns raking the German fighter from 300 yards until it exploded. Then enemy flak found him, 88mm shells detonating close enough to shred control surfaces and punch holes through the P-47's fuselage. Preddy bailed out over the English Channel. January water temperatures in the Channel run about 8 degrees Celsius, cold enough to kill in minutes through hypothermia, even if you're wearing an immersion suit, which most pilots weren't. His wingman, Lieutenant William Wisner, saw him go down and did something that probably saved Preddy's life. Wisner stayed overhead, circling, burning fuel he couldn't afford to burn, radioing Preddy's position over and over until Air-Sea Rescue could triangulate the coordinates and dispatch a Royal Air Force flying boat. The rescue itself was nearly as dangerous as the shoot-down. The flying boat crew spotted Preddy in the rough seas and attempted to taxi close enough to pull him aboard. Instead, one of the aircraft's pontoons struck him in the water, bruising him severely and nearly drowning him before they managed to haul him into the aircraft. Then, attempting to take off in the heavy swells, a wave broke off one of the pontoons, leaving the flying boat unable to get airborne. They sat there in the channel, wallowing in the waves, waiting for a Royal Navy launch to come tow them to port. The British crew had contraband brandy aboard, because of course they did, and by the time the launch arrived several hours later, Preddy and his rescuers were thoroughly thawed and slightly drunk. He returned to Bodney bruised, grateful, and more convinced than ever that his luck wouldn't last forever. Better make every mission count. In April 1944, the 352nd Fighter Group began converting to the North American P-51 Mustang, and everything changed. The Mustang was what the Thunderbolt wanted to be: fast, maneuverable, long-ranged, with enough fuel capacity to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The key was the Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, a masterpiece of British engineering that transformed a mediocre medium-altitude fighter into the best high-altitude fighter in the European theatre. Preddy fell in love with the Mustang immediately. In the P-47, he'd been competitive. In the P-51, he was dominant. The aircraft responded to control inputs like it was reading his mind, turning where he looked, diving when he thought about diving, climbing like it had forgotten about gravity. On May 13, 1944, flying a bomber escort to Neubrandenburg, Preddy shot down 2 Bf-109s and officially became a flying ace. But becoming an ace was just the beginning. What George Preddy did between May and August 1944 would establish him as something more than just another skilled fighter pilot. He became a hunter, and the Luftwaffe became his prey. June 20th, 1944, escorting bombers to Magdeburg. Preddy spotted 15 Messerschmitt Me-410s, twin-engine heavy fighters forming up at 28,000 feet, preparing to attack the bomber stream with their formidable forward-firing armament. He took his squadron up, intercepting from 1,000 feet above, and dove into the German formation. One Focke-Wulf 4-190 destroyed, one Me-4-10 shared with Lieutenant James Woods. His victory count was climbing. July 18, 1944 was Preddy's biggest day before the legendary August 6th mission. The mission that day involved 1,600 heavy bombers and 350 medium bombers, dropping 7,700 tons of ordnance on targets across Germany, escorted by over 500 fighters, more than half of them P-51s. The Luftwaffe came up to contest the raid in force, and Preddy's squadron encountered them northeast of Rostock at 900 hours. His encounter report describes what happened with the clinical precision the Army Air Forces required, leading the squadron on a sweep south of the bombers, heading north to intercept enemy fighters approaching the formation. 50-plus enemy aircraft in the sky, Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs mixing it up with P-38s and P-51s in the kind of massive furball that turned the sky into a three-dimensional chess match played at 400 miles per hour with machine guns. Preddy picked out an Me-109 in a steep left turn and fired at 50 to 30 degrees deflection. No hits. By this point, only his left inboard gun was still functioning, the others jammed or out of ammunition. He drove up behind another one, 09, closed to 75 yards, fired with 5 degrees deflection. Still no hits. With only one gun working and ammunition running low, most pilots would have called it a day and headed home. Preddy claimed one Messerschmitt destroyed and one probably destroyed before disengaging. 4 kills in July. His P-51D, serial number 4413321, now carried 21 victory crosses painted on its fuselage. The ground crew was running out of space. Preddy's new mount, received in June, had proven to be possibly the most successful fighter aircraft in the entire 8th Air Force. It was fast, it was reliable, and in Preddy's hands, it was absolutely lethal. The evening of August 5th, 1944, RAF Bodny Officers Club. Weather forecast for the next day predicted terrible conditions, so the mission was expected to be scrubbed. Preddy and a couple of friends decided to relax with a game of craps. George Preddy loved gambling, loved the risk, the adrenaline, the moment when dice hit felt, and your fate was determined by physics and chance. That night, the dice loved him back. He started winning, then kept winning, then couldn't stop winning. By the time he yelled his final, "Cripes A Mighty," and made his last roll, he'd cleaned out everyone at the table to the tune of $1,200, a fortune in 1944 money. He went to bed late, slightly drunk, $1,200 richer, and completely unprepared for the fact that the mission hadn't been scrubbed after all. Wake-up call came at 0400 hours. August 6th, 1944. Mission briefing. Hamburg, Germany. Industrial targets, heavy bomber escort, expected opposition, significant. Preddy, nursing a spectacular hangover, listened to the intelligence officer describe what they'd be facing. German fighters positioned to intercept, flak concentrations, the usual catalogue of ways to die over occupied Europe. He climbed into Cripes A Mighty Third, ran through his pre-flight checks, and tried to remember if he'd ever felt this terrible before a mission. The formation assembled over England, hundreds of bombers and fighters joining up into the combat boxes that would carry them deep into German airspace. Preddy led his squadron toward the target, scanning constantly for enemy fighters, knowing they'd come, knowing the Luftwaffe couldn't afford to let 300 bombers hit Hamburg unopposed. At 27,000 feet, approaching the target, he spotted them. 30-plus Bf-109s, forming up in the sun, preparing to attack the bombers from ahead and above, where American defensive fire was weakest. The German pilots were focused entirely on the bombers, hadn't seen the P-51 escorts yet, tactical mistake that was about to cost them everything. Preddy made his call. "Tally-ho, bandits 12 o'clock high, follow me in." He pushed his throttle forward, felt the Merlin engine respond with its characteristic howl, and dove his squadron into the German formation from astern, the absolute worst angle to be attacked from because you never see it coming. His first burst caught a 109 by surprise, 30 caliber rounds walking up the fuselage from tail to cockpit. The Messerschmitt rolled inverted and fell away, trailing fire. Kill number 1. Preddy immediately acquired another target, a 109 trying to break left and escape. He followed the break, led the target, and fired a 2-second burst. The German fighter's right wing came off, centrifugal force pulling it away from the fuselage. Kill number 2. The Germans realized they were being attacked, and the formation disintegrated into individual fights, each pilot trying to survive, trying to get a shot, trying to position for advantage. Preddy stayed in the fight, his years of experience telling him where to look, how to anticipate, where the next threat would come from. Third 109 fell to a deflection shot from 300 yards. Fourth one fell as the Germans tried to escape, diving away from the bombers they'd never reached. Fifth one fell as Preddy followed them down through 20,000 feet. By this point, his wingmen had scattered, each engaged in their own fights. Preddy was alone at 5,000 feet, low on ammunition, surrounded by confused German and American fighters, and he spotted one more Messerschmitt trying to extend away from the fight. He closed to 200 yards, centered the dot of his gun sight on the enemy fighter's engine cowling, and fired his remaining ammunition in one long burst. The Messerschmitt exploded. 6 kills. 1 mission. 12 minutes of combat. George Preddy had just become one of 38 Army Air Forces pilots to earn the designation Ace in a Day, shooting down 5 or more enemy aircraft in a single engagement. He'd actually exceeded that, putting him in even more exclusive company. His gun camera footage would be reviewed, verified, confirmed. Every kill was legitimate. Every claim would stand. When Preddy landed at Bodny, there was a crowd waiting. Word had spread through the ground crews, through the other squadrons, through the entire fighter group. The pilot who'd been too small for the Navy, who'd worked in a cotton mill, who'd barnstormed county fairs for $2 a ride, had just executed the most devastating single-pilot fighter mission of the war to date. August 7th. Photographers and war correspondents descended on RAF Bodny like locusts. George Preddy, nursing his hangover into its second day, submitted to interviews, photo shoots, gun camera footage reviews, and the kind of attention that most fighter pilots found uncomfortable. He was naturally modest, didn't enjoy talking about his kills, preferred to credit his aircraft and his ground crew and his wingmen. The reporters wanted a hero, someone they could write about, someone America could rally behind. Preddy gave them what they needed, but privately he just wanted to get back to flying. His squadron commander, Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, recommended Preddy for the Medal of Honor, America's highest military decoration. The recommendation detailed the August 6th mission, described Preddy's tactical brilliance, his courage under fire, his contribution to the bomber escort mission's success. Meyer's recommendation went up the chain, through Fighter Command, through 8th Air Force Headquarters, all the way to European Theatre Command. On August 12, 1944, Brigadier General Edward Anderson pinned the Distinguished Service Cross on George Preddy's uniform. Not the Medal of Honor that Meyer had requested, the second highest, decoration instead. Why the downgrade? Nobody ever explained officially. Maybe the bar for the Medal of Honor was simply too high. Maybe someone in the approval chain thought 6 kills didn't quite meet the standard. Maybe it was politics, bureaucracy, the kind of institutional decision-making that values process over results. Preddy didn't complain publicly. The Distinguished Service Cross was still a significant honor, still recognition of what he'd accomplished. But Meyer was furious. He believed his pilot deserved the highest recognition the nation could offer, and settling for second best felt like an insult. Years later, after Preddy's death, efforts would be made to have his award upgraded posthumously. They would fail, tangled in regulations and procedures, and the uncomfortable reality that the Medal of Honor is rarely awarded retroactively, no matter how deserving the candidate. After his August victories, Preddy's score stood at 25.8 to 3 confirmed kills, including shared victories where credit was split between multiple pilots. He'd also destroyed 5 aircraft on the ground during strafing runs, bringing his total destruction count to over 30 enemy aircraft. He was the highest-scoring P-51 ace in the 8th Air Force, and he was only 25 years old. The Army Air Forces sent him home for 30 days leave, standard procedure for pilots who'd exceeded their expected tour length. Preddy returned to Greensboro in late August, 1944, a genuine hometown hero. The local papers ran his photo. He gave speeches at schools, at civic organizations, at war bond drives. He visited his parents, spent time with his younger brother William, also a fighter pilot, and tried to readjust to a world where people weren't actively trying to kill him. It didn't take. 30 days felt like 30 years. By October, Preddy was pulling strings to get back to England, back to his squadron, back to the war. He extended his combat tour, volunteering for additional missions when he could have stayed stateside as an instructor or test pilot. Most men who survived their first tour considered themselves lucky and moved on to safer assignments. George Preddy went back for more. When he returned to England in late October 1944, he found the 352nd Fighter Group had some changes waiting for him. He was promoted to Major, and he was given command of the 328th Fighter Squadron, the group's worst-performing squadron, the one with the lowest kill count, the one with morale problems. His orders were simple: fix it. Preddy threw himself into the job with the same intensity he brought to combat flying. He flew with the new pilots, taught them his techniques, emphasized aggressive but smart tactics. He stressed the importance of teamwork, of keeping your wingman alive, of not getting so focused on scoring kills that you forgot the primary mission was bringing everyone home. Under his leadership, the 328th began to turn around. November 2nd, 1944, bomber escort to Merseburg, Germany. Preddy led his squadron on the mission, and at 33,000 feet he spotted contrails, the telltale sign of high-altitude fighters positioning to attack. The contrails belonged to Messerschmitt Bf 109s that had leveled off at their service ceiling, hoping to dive through the American escorts to reach the bombers below. The Germans weren't expecting the Mustangs to climb that high. They'd grown accustomed to earlier American fighters that struggled above 25,000 feet. The P-51 had no such limitations. Preddy led an attack that scattered the German formation before they could reach the bombers. He shot down one Bf 109 using his P-51's new K-14 lead computing gun sight, a gyroscopic marvel that made deflection shooting dramatically easier. More importantly, the rest of his squadron shot down 24 enemy aircraft, setting an 8th Air Force record for aerial victories by a single squadron in one mission. The 328th Fighter Squadron, the unit with morale problems and the lowest kill count just weeks earlier, had just proven they could compete with anyone in the theatre. Following day, November 3rd, Preddy shot down another Focke-Wulf Fock 190. His score now stood at 26.8 to 3 aerial victories. He was the leading P-51 ace in the European theatre, ahead of pilots with more time in theatre, ahead of pilots who'd started their tours earlier. At the rate he was going, he'd break every record in the book if he survived long enough. By mid-December 1944, the war was entering its final phase. Everyone knew Germany was losing. The question wasn't if the Allies would win, but when, and at what cost. The Luftwaffe was bleeding experienced pilots faster than they could train replacements. German aircraft production remained high, factories churning out fighters right up until Allied bombers turned those factories into rubble, but pilots were irreplaceable. You can build a Messerschmitt in weeks. Training a competent fighter pilot takes years. The Ardennes offensive, what would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, began December 16, 1944. Germany's last major counterattack in the West, a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. Elements of the 352nd Fighter Group, including Preddy's 328th Squadron, moved forward to Advanced Fighter Strip Y-29 near Asch, Belgium, to provide close air support for ground forces trying to contain the German breakthrough. The missions changed from bomber escort to ground attack, to reconnaissance, to aerial patrols hunting for German fighters and bombers attempting to support their ground forces. It was dangerous work, flying low and slow where every German soldier with a rifle could take a gunshot, where the weather was terrible and visibility worse. Christmas Eve, 1944, Preddy indulged in another craps game at the Officers' Club. Once again, the dice loved him. By the time the game ended, he'd won $1,200, the exact same amount he'd won before his legendary August 6th mission. He planned to invest it in war bonds, told his friends about it. went to bed thinking about the mission scheduled for Christmas morning. Christmas Day, 1944, dawned cold and clear over Belgium. Preddy led 10 P-51s on patrol, hunting for German aircraft supporting the Ardennes offensive. 3 hours into the patrol, ground control vectored them to a dogfight already in progress, American fighters engaging German Bf-109s southeast of Liège. Preddy arrived to find the fight scattered across the sky, individual duels between pilots trying to gain advantage, trying to survive. He engaged 2 Bf-109s, shot them both down, brought his total to 28.8 to 3 confirmed kills. Then ground control reported more bandits, German fighters strafing American ground forces at low altitude near Langebehe. Preddy and his wingman, Lieutenant James Carty, broke off from the main fight and dove toward the reported position. They spotted a lone Focke-Wulf Fock 190 on the deck, barely 50 feet above the frozen ground, making strafing runs on American positions. Preddy went after it, pushing his throttle forward, descending through 1,000 feet, 500 feet, treetop height. The Focke-Wulf saw them coming and tried to escape, flying nap of the earth through Belgian farmland, using terrain and buildings for cover. Preddy followed, Carty on his wing, both Mustangs screaming across the snow-covered fields at over 300 miles per hour. American anti-aircraft positions saw aircraft approaching at extremely low altitude and did what they were trained to do. They opened fire, quad 50 caliber, machine gun batteries, positioned to defend against exactly this kind of low-altitude attack, tracked the incoming aircraft and fired. Multiple guns, multiple positions, hundreds of rounds per second creating an interlocking wall of fire that nothing could survive. The gunners couldn't tell the difference between German and American aircraft at that speed, at that altitude, in that visibility. They'd been told all local air units had been notified to stand down during ground attack missions. Communications failure meant some units never got the word. Preddy's P-51 took multiple hits. 50 caliber rounds, the same ammunition his own guns carried, punched through aluminum skin, through control surfaces, through vital components. His aircraft chandelled sharply up and left, Preddy trying to gain altitude for bailout, trying to reach safe ejection height. Witnesses on the ground saw his canopy pop open, saw him attempt to bail out. The Mustang was too low, moving too fast, pulling too many Gs in the climb. At a few 100 feet altitude, Preddy went over the side. His parachute deployed, or partially deployed, accounts vary. It didn't matter. There wasn't enough altitude for the chute to fully inflate and arrest his descent. George Earl Preddy Jr., age 25, the highest-scoring P-51 Mustang ace of World War II, hit the frozen Belgian ground at terminal velocity. Death was instantaneous. Pilot error wasn't involved. Mechanical failure didn't cause it. The Luftwaffe, despite trying for 18 months, hadn't managed to kill him. Friendly fire did what enemy fire couldn't. A tragic mistake, communications breakdown, the fog of war compressed into a few terrible seconds that erased one of America's finest fighter pilots. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The news reached RAF Bodny within hours. Radio silence broken by the kind of transmission nobody wants to hear. Major George Preddy, commanding officer of the 328th Fighter Squadron, killed in action over Belgium. Friendly fire. The words didn't make sense together. How does the pilot who survived Darwin, who walked away from a mid-air collision, who bailed out over the Channel, who fought through hundreds of missions against the most experienced fighter pilots Germany could field, how does that pilot die from American bullets? Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer, Preddy's friend and former squadron commander, took the news hardest. Meyer himself was a 26 Victory ace, would eventually rise to 4-star rank as Commander of Strategic Air Command, but on Christmas Day 1944 he was just a man who'd lost someone he considered the finest fighter pilot he'd ever seen. Meyer would later write that George Preddy was the complete fighter pilot, possessing not just skill and courage, but an intense desire to excel that drove him to levels of performance other pilots couldn't match. The official investigation into the incident was brief and unsatisfying. The anti-aircraft battery that fired the fatal shots belonged to the 430th Anti-Aircraft Battalion, Line Corps. Their standing orders required them to engage any low-flying aircraft in their sector. They'd been told to expect ground attack missions by friendly fighters, but the message either didn't reach them or reached them too late. The gunners who killed Preddy never knew they'd just shot down America's top Mustang ace. They thought they were defending their positions against German attack. No charges were filed. No one was court-martialed. It was ruled an accident, a tragic but unavoidable consequence of combat operations, where fast-moving aircraft operated at extremely low altitude in contested airspace. The official Army Air Force's position was that battlefield communications failures were regrettable but inevitable, and that no individual negligence could be established. The gunners had followed their training and their orders. Preddy had been pursuing a legitimate target. Sometimes, in war, doing everything right still gets you killed. Preddy's body was recovered from the crash site and initially buried in a temporary military cemetery in Belgium. His personal effects were collected, inventoried, sent home to his parents in Greensboro. Among those effects was the $1,200 he'd won at craps on Christmas Eve, money he'd planned to invest in war bonds, money he'd never get to spend. His final P-51D, serial number 4414906, tail code PEP, was destroyed in the crash. The aircraft he'd flown to 28 victories would never fly again. The 328th Fighter Squadron held a memorial service at RAF Bodney in early January 1945. Preddy's fellow pilots gathered in the chapel. Officers and enlisted men who'd flown with him, learned from him, survived because of his leadership. They told stories about his gambling, his favourite expression, Cripes A Mighty, his absolute fearlessness in combat, his willingness to teach new pilots the tricks that kept you alive. They noted that of all the wingmen who'd flown with George Preddy through his combat career, he'd lost only one. In a war where wingmen died regularly, that statistic spoke volumes about how Preddy fought. Back in Greensboro, George's parents received the telegram every military family dreaded. The War Department regrets to inform you. George Earl Preddy Sr., the Southern Railway employee who'd watched his son grow from a cotton mill worker into America's top Mustang ace, took the news in silence. Clara Preddy, his mother, received visitors, accepted condolences, and tried to process the fact that her son had survived so much only to die on Christmas morning from friendly fire. The local newspapers ran obituaries describing Preddy's accomplishments: 26.8-3 aerial victories, officially credited and verified. 5 aircraft destroyed on the ground, 143 combat missions, over 530 hours of combat flight time, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star with Oak Leaf Cluster, Distinguished Flying Cross with 8 Oak Leaf Clusters, Air Medal with 7 Oak Leaf Clusters, and, posthumously, the Purple Heart and the Belgian Croix de Guerre. George Preddy was buried at Lorraine American Cemetery in Saint-Avold, France, alongside thousands of other American servicemen who died liberating Europe. His grave marker lists his rank, his unit, his date of death. It doesn't mention that he was the highest-scoring P-51 ace of the war. It doesn't need to. The pilots who survived knew. The German pilots who faced him knew. The bomber crews he escorted to Berlin and back knew. In the immediate aftermath of his death, the 328th Fighter Squadron continued operations through the remainder of the Battle of the Bulge. The German offensive was contained by early January 1945, then pushed back, then collapsed completely as Allied forces counterattacked with overwhelming superiority in men, material, and air power. The Luftwaffe, already depleted by months of attrition, never recovered from the losses sustained during the Ardennes campaign. By February 1945, American and British forces were crossing the Rhine, pushing into Germany itself. The strategic bombing campaign that Preddy had helped make possible by escorting bombers deep into German territory was reaching its climax. German cities were being systematically destroyed. Industrial capacity was collapsing. Fuel shortages grounded much of the remaining Luftwaffe fighter force. The war in Europe had perhaps 3 months left, but for the Preddy family, the war had one more tragedy waiting. George's younger brother, William Preddy, was also a P-51 pilot, flying with the 503rd Fighter Squadron, 39th Fighter Group. William, age 20, had scored 2 aerial victories by spring 1945. He idolized his older brother, flew the same aircraft type, adopted similar tactics. On April 17, 1945, William's squadron was conducting ground attack operations over Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, strafing German positions in advance of Allied ground forces. German anti-aircraft fire found William's Mustang at low altitude. He was hit, wounded, and his aircraft was damaged beyond recovery. William managed to keep control long enough to execute a forced landing, but his wounds were severe. He died shortly after the crash, less than 3 weeks before Germany's unconditional surrender ended the war in Europe. The Preddy family had lost both sons, both fighter pilots, both killed in the final months of a war their country was clearly winning. George and William Preddy were buried side by side at Saint-Avold, 2 brothers who'd wanted nothing more than to fly, who'd both achieved that dream, and who'd both paid the ultimate price. Their graves became a destination for military historians, for aviation enthusiasts, for people who wanted to honor the sacrifice of men who died fighting fascism. Veterans of the 352nd Fighter Group made pilgrimages to Saint-Avold in the decades after the war, standing at Preddy's grave, remembering the pilot who'd led them, taught them, showed them what excellence looked like. The official recognition of George Preddy's achievements continued long after his death. In 1968, Business Interstate 85 through Greensboro was renamed Preddy Boulevard, honoring both brothers. Veterans of foreign wars, post 20087 in Greensboro, took George's name as their identifier. The Preddy Memorial Foundation, established by his cousin Joe Noah, worked to preserve his legacy and educate new generations about his contributions to Allied victory. In the decades since World War II, military historians have debated where Preddy ranks among American fighter aces. By aerial victories, he's the top P-51 ace with 26.8 to 3 confirmed kills. Overall, he ranks 6th among American aces in the European theatre, behind pilots like Francis Gabreski and Robert Johnson, who flew more missions and had more opportunities for combat. But if you measure effectiveness by victories per mission flown, Preddy's ratio is extraordinary. 26.8 to 3 kills in 143 missions works out to nearly 1 victory every 5 missions, a rate that few pilots ever matched. What makes Preddy's record even more remarkable is the concentration of his victories in such a short time frame. He scored his first confirmed kill in December 1943. He died in December 1944, 12 months, 26.8 to 3 victories. From May through August 1944, he was scoring kills at a rate that suggested he might become the highest-scoring American ace of the entire war if he lived long enough. He didn't live long enough. The what-if question haunts Preddy's story. What if he'd survived the war? What if those American gunners had been properly notified about friendly air operations? What if communications hadn't failed at exactly the wrong moment? Preddy was 25 years old when he died, flying at the peak of his abilities, with the Luftwaffe increasingly depleted and American air superiority absolute. If he'd survived to May 1945, how many more victories would he have accumulated? Some historians suggest he could have reached 40 victories, possibly more. Others argue that by late 1944, opportunities for aerial combat were declining rapidly as the Luftwaffe conserved its remaining fighters for defense of the homeland. Either way, Preddy's death on Christmas Day 1944 ensured that his final tally of 26.8 to 3 kills would stand as his permanent record, forever frozen at the moment friendly fire ended his career. The investigation into whether Preddy deserved the Medal of Honor rather than the Distinguished Service Cross continued for years after his death. John C. Meyer remained convinced that his friend and protégé had earned the nation's highest military decoration for the August 6th mission alone. In 2007, the Preddy Memorial Foundation formally petitioned the Secretary of the Army to posthumously upgrade Preddy's award. They compiled testimony from surviving pilots, reviewed the original mission reports, documented the tactical significance of destroying 6 enemy fighters in a single engagement while protecting a bomber formation. The petition was denied. Army regulations regarding posthumous Medal of Honor upgrades are strict, requiring new evidence that wasn't available at the time of the original award decision. The Distinguished Service Cross recommendation had been properly reviewed by the chain of command in 1944, and that decision stood. The denial didn't diminish Preddy's accomplishments, but it did leave his supporters frustrated that the nation's recognition never quite matched his actual contributions. The P-51 Mustang that George Preddy flew during his most successful period, serial number 4413321, Cripes A Mighty Third, survived him by only 4 months. After Preddy returned to the United States following his August victories, the aircraft was reassigned to other pilots in the 352nd Fighter Group. Lieutenant Colonel John C. Meyer flew it. Captain Henry Stewart flew it. Several others took turns in what had become the highest-scoring P-51 in the 8th Air Force. On April 16, 1945, First Lieutenant Walter Padden was flying 4413321 on a mission near Regensburg, Germany. After escorting bombers to the target, Padden's flight was and hunting targets of opportunity when they spotted Ganneke airfield loaded with German aircraft. Padden dove to attack and was hit by German anti-aircraft fire. He and Cripes A Mighty Third went down together, both killed in the same crash. The aircraft that had served George Preddy so well, that had carried him through dozens of missions and 21 of his victories, died the same way its most famous pilot had died, shot down by ground fire at low altitude. Today, several P-51 Mustangs wear the Cripes A Mighty paint scheme in tribute to Preddy. These are restored warbirds, owned by collectors and museums, flown at air shows and commemorative events. The most famous is probably the P-51D, owned by Kermit Weeks, registration number N921, painted to represent Cripes A Mighty Third, as it appeared in summer 1944. Weeks' aircraft has appeared in numerous documentaries, air shows, and historical presentations, keeping Preddy's memory alive for audiences who weren't born until decades after World War II ended. Another faithful recreation was completed by Midwest Aero Restorations in the 2000s, restoring P-51D serial number 4474813 to represent Preddy's final mount. The restoration took years, required extensive research to ensure historical accuracy, and resulted in an aircraft that looks exactly as it would have appeared at RAF Bodny in late 1944. The restored Mustang flies regularly, a living memorial to the pilot who made the type famous. George Preddy's tactical approach to fighter combat became a case study taught at military aviation schools for decades after the war. His emphasis on aggressive but calculated attacks, his willingness to press attacks to extremely close range to ensure kills, his ability to maintain situational awareness in chaotic multi-aircraft engagements, all became elements of fighter pilot training. The specific techniques evolved as aircraft, technology advanced from propeller-driven fighters to jets to modern 4th and 5th generation aircraft, but the underlying principles Preddy demonstrated remained constant. Close with the enemy, press your attacks, protect your wingman, know when to break off, survive to fight again tomorrow. These weren't revolutionary concepts, but Preddy executed them with a consistency and effectiveness that few pilots ever matched. His 6-kill mission on August 6, 1944, remained the single mission record for the 8th Air Force throughout the war. Other pilots tied it, but none exceeded it. That record stood for decades as a benchmark of what the absolute peak performance in air-to-air combat looked like. The broader context of Preddy's achievements involves understanding what the P-51 Mustang meant to Allied victory in Europe. Before the Mustang entered service in large numbers, American daylight bombing raids were suffering catastrophic losses. Unescorted bombers penetrating deep into German airspace faced coordinated attacks by experienced Luftwaffe pilots flying excellent aircraft like the Bf-109G and W-190A. Loss rates sometimes exceeded 20% of aircraft dispatched. Those numbers were unsustainable. The P-51 changed everything. Its combination of range, performance, and reliability meant American bombers could be escorted all the way to their targets and all the way back. German fighters that tried to attack the bomber formations had to fight through screens of Mustangs first. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe pilots was significant. They'd grown accustomed to attacking unescorted or lightly escorted bombers. Suddenly, they were facing skilled American pilots in aircraft that could match or exceed their own fighters' performance at any altitude. Pilots like George Preddy personified that change. When German fighter pilots encountered Mustangs over Berlin or Munich or Hamburg, they weren't facing relatively inexperienced American pilots of 1942 and early 1943. They were facing veterans, aces, pilots who'd learned from 2 years of combat and were flying the best fighter aircraft in the theatre. The result was a systematic destruction of the Luftwaffe's experienced pilot cadre through the second half of 1944. Germany never recovered from those losses. They could build new fighters. They couldn't build new experienced pilots. Training programs were compressed. Flight hours were reduced. New pilots arrived at frontline units with minimal preparation and died within weeks or days of their first combat missions. By early 1945, the Luftwaffe fighter force was a shadow of what it had been in 1943. Fuel shortages grounded many aircraft. Lack of experienced pilots grounded others. American air superiority over Germany was absolute. George Preddy's 26.8-3 victories represented more than just individual achievement. Each kill was one less Luftwaffe pilot attacking Allied bombers, one less obstacle to the strategic bombing campaign that was destroying Germany's industrial capacity, one less defender available when Allied forces invaded France and pushed toward Berlin. Multiply Preddy's contribution by the hundreds of other American fighter aces, and you begin to understand how air superiority was achieved and maintained. The cost of that achievement was measured in pilots like Preddy who didn't come home. The 8th Air Force lost thousands of aircrew during the war, bomber crews and fighter pilots, men who died over Germany or in the Channel, or in Preddy's case, in Belgium from friendly fire. Each loss was a tragedy for families back home, for squadrons that lost friends and leaders, for a nation that was spending its youth to defeat fascism. Preddy's story resonates because it contains elements that transcend individual biography. The farm state kid who overcame rejection and poverty to achieve excellence. The pilot who flew the same aircraft through dozens of missions, building a bond between man and machine that became legendary. The leader who transformed an underperforming squadron into one of the best in the theatre. The ace who scored 6 kills in one mission and wanted to keep flying rather than rest on his laurels. And finally, the tragic death that came not from enemy action, but from the confusion and chaos inherent in modern warfare. In the years since World War II, historians have documented countless similar stories. Pilots who excelled, who led, who died in ways that seemed senseless. But Preddy's story stands out because of the sheer concentration of achievement in such a short time. 12 months from first kill to death, 26.8-3 victories, 143 missions, age 25 at death. Those numbers define a career compressed into a time frame most people can barely comprehend. Modern fighter pilots studying Preddy's combat record note several characteristics that made him effective. First, his gunnery was exceptional. Many pilots in World War II expended thousands of rounds to achieve a single kill. Preddy's gun camera footage shows him firing short, precise bursts, often at extremely close range where missing was almost impossible. He understood that ammunition was a finite resource, and wasting it on low-probability shots reduced your effectiveness in subsequent engagements. Second, his situational awareness allowed him to dominate multi-aircraft fights. In the chaotic three-dimensional battlefield of air combat, knowing where all the threats are, where your wingmen are, where the targets are, requires processing information faster than conscious thought allows. Preddy possessed that ability naturally, enhanced by hundreds of hours of practice. He could track multiple aircraft simultaneously, predict their movements, position himself for attacks that other pilots never time straight saw coming. Third, His willingness to press attacks to very close range gave him higher kill probabilities. Many pilots opened fire at 400 or 500 yards, distances where deflection shooting became extremely difficult and hit probability dropped dramatically. Preddy routinely closed to 200 yards or less, sometimes as close as 75 yards, putting himself at greater risk, but ensuring that when he fired, his targets died. That aggressiveness, combined with skill, produced his remarkable success rate. Fourth, and perhaps most important, his decision-making under pressure was consistently excellent. He knew when to attack, when to break off, when to pursue, when to protect the bombers, when to engage enemy fighters, when to conserve ammunition and fuel for the flight home. Combat flying is full of split-second decisions where wrong choices get you killed. Preddy made the right choices with a consistency that kept him alive through 143 missions in one of the most dangerous jobs in the war. That consistency makes his death even more tragic. He didn't make a mistake on Christmas Day 1944. He identified a legitimate target, pursued it using appropriate tactics, and died because of a communications failure that put him in the wrong place at the wrong time. No amount of skill or experience could have saved him from that. Sometimes in war, even the best die for reasons that have nothing to do with their competence or courage. The legacy George Preddy left goes beyond his victory count. He proved that America could produce fighter pilots who matched or exceeded the best the Luftwaffe could field. He demonstrated that the P-51 Mustang, when flown by a skilled pilot, was the premier fighter aircraft of the European theatre. He showed that leadership mattered, that taking command of an underperforming squadron and transforming it through example and training produced measurable results. And his death reminded everyone that war is fundamentally unjust, taking the best alongside the worst, the skilled alongside the unskilled, the lucky alongside the unlucky. Today, more than 80 years after World War II, George Preddy's name appears in aviation museums, in history books, in documentaries about fighter aces. His gun camera footage from the August 6th mission is used in presentations about aerial combat tactics. His P-51, or rather the recreations of his P-51, still fly at air shows where audiences watch them perform and try to imagine what it was like to fight in those aircraft at 27,000 feet over Germany, with enemy fighters all around and your life depending on split-second decisions. Veterans of the 352nd Fighter Group kept Preddy's memory alive through reunions, through oral history projects, through ensuring that younger generations understood what men like George accomplished. As those veterans aged and passed away, the responsibility for preserving that memory shifted to historians, to museums, to families like the Preddys who maintained their own records and artifacts. The Preddy Memorial Foundation continues to honor both George and William, collecting documents, conducting research, supporting efforts to tell their stories. In Greensboro, where George Preddy grew up, worked in a cotton mill, and dreamed of flying, his name is still remembered. Local schools teach about their hometown ace. Veterans organizations hold ceremonies honoring both Preddy brothers. The street that bears his name reminds daily commuters that ordinary places produce extraordinary people when circumstances demand it. George Preddy was just a kid from Greensboro until the war gave him an opportunity to prove what he could do. He proved it 26.8 to 3 times. The question of whether he was the greatest fighter pilot of World War II is ultimately unanswerable because greatest is subjective. By pure numbers, pilots like Richard Bong with 40 victories or Erich Hartmann with 352 victories in the Luftwaffe far exceeded Preddy's count. But Bong flew in the Pacific, where opportunities for combat were more frequent. Hartmann flew on the Eastern Front for years against Soviet pilots who were often poorly trained and flying inferior aircraft. Comparing achievements across different theaters, different time periods, different operational contexts produces conclusions that tell you more about your criteria than about objective greatness. What's not debatable is that George Preddy was the top P-51 ace of the war, that he achieved that status in remarkably short time, that he led his squadron with distinction, and that his death on Christmas Day 1944 deprived America of one of its finest fighter pilots. If he'd survived, if those communications hadn't failed, if friendly gunners had held fire for another few seconds, would Preddy have gone on to break every record? Would he have become the highest-scoring American ace of all time? Would his post-war career have mirrored John C. Meyer's rise to 4-star rank? Those are questions that can never be answered. What we know is what actually happened. A kid from North Carolina who worked in a cotton mill and got rejected by the Navy 3 times, became a fighter pilot, became an ace, became a legend, and died at age 25 from friendly fire while pursuing the enemy he'd fought so effectively for 12 months. His story is both inspirational and tragic, showing what individuals can achieve when circumstances align, but also showing how fragile life is when you're flying at 300 miles per hour, 50 feet above frozen Belgian ground with quad 50 caliber machine guns, tracking you. The men who flew with George Preddy, who learned from him, who survived because he taught them how to fight and how to survive, carried his lessons forward. They applied those lessons in the remaining months of World War II, in Korea, when some of them returned to combat, in their post-war careers as test pilots and instructors and commanders. Preddy's influence rippled outward through people he trained, through tactics he validated, through the example he set. That kind of legacy isn't measured in victory counts or medals. It's measured in lives saved, in battles won, in a culture of excellence that persists long after the individual who established it is gone. Modern air warfare has changed dramatically since 1944. Jets replaced propeller aircraft. Missiles replaced guns as primary weapons. Radar and avionics transformed how fighters detect and engage threats. The kind of visual range dogfighting that Preddy excelled at is increasingly rare in an era where combat often occurs beyond visual range, using weapons guided by computers and radar. But the fundamental principles of air combat, situational awareness, tactical decision-making, aggressive but calculated attacks, protection of wingmen, remain unchanged. Pilots flying F-35s today learn the same essential lessons that George Preddy mastered in his P-51 80 years ago. That continuity is what makes stories like Preddy's relevant to contemporary audiences. The technology changes, but human factors remain constant. Courage still matters, skill still matters. Leadership still matters, training still matters, and luck still matters, as Preddy's death from friendly fire so tragically demonstrated. Understanding how individuals performed under the extreme stress of combat, what worked, what didn't, why some pilots survived and others didn't, provides insights applicable to any high-stress profession where split-second decisions carry life or death consequences. George Preddy's final resting place at Lorraine American Cemetery in Saint-Avold, France, sits among rows of white crosses and stars of David, marking the graves of more than 10,000 American servicemen who died in World War II. Plot C, row 37, grave 54. Next to him lies his brother William, Plot C, row 37, grave 55. 2 brothers, 2 pilots, 2 lives ended in service to their country. The cemetery is meticulously maintained by the American Battle Monuments Commission, ensuring that future generations can visit and remember. Every year, visitors come to Saint-Avold from around the world. Some are historians researching specific units or individuals. Some are family members of those buried there, descendants who never met the grandparents or great-uncles who died before they were born. Some are aviation enthusiasts who want to pay respects to pilots they've read about and admired. And some are just travelers who stumble upon the cemetery and spend time walking the rows, reading names, trying to comprehend the scale of sacrifice represented by those 10,000 graves. When visitors stand at George Preddy's grave, they see a simple marker with his name, rank, unit, and date of death. They don't see the cotton mill worker who saved money for college. They don't see the barnstormer flying county fairs for $2. They don't see the man rejected by the Navy 3 times. They don't see the pilot who survived a mid-air collision in Australia or a bailout over the Channel. They don't see the 6 kills in 12 minutes over Hamburg, or the transformation of the 328th Squadron, or the Christmas Eve craps game, where he won $1,200. All of that is invisible, preserved only in documents and memories and stories passed down. but maybe that's appropriate. Cemeteries honor the sacrifice, not the details. The White Cross says everything that matters. This person served. This person died. This person gave everything they had so that others might live in freedom. The rest, the victories and decorations and leadership and tragedy, those are for historians and families and people who care about the details. For most visitors to St. Avold, it's enough to know that the men buried there answered their nation's call and paid the ultimate price. George Preddy would probably have been uncomfortable with the attention his story receives. He was naturally modest, didn't seek publicity, preferred to credit his aircraft and ground crew and wingmen rather than taking personal credit for his achievements. The war correspondents and photographers who descended on RAF Bodney after his 6-kill mission found him reluctant to talk about himself, more interested in getting back to flying than sitting for interviews. That modesty is a common characteristic among the greatest fighter aces, a recognition that survival involves substantial luck alongside skill, and that talking too much about your achievements tempts fate in a profession where fate has a twisted sense of humor. But modesty doesn't diminish achievement. George Preddy was exceptional, and the historical record proves it. 26.8-3 confirmed victories in 12 months of combat flying. Highest-scoring P-51 ace of World War II. Leader of one of the most successful fighter squadrons in the 8th Air Force. Teacher who trained younger pilots and kept his wingmen alive. And finally, victim of friendly fire on Christmas morning 1944, dead at 25, buried in France alongside his brother and 10,000 other Americans who never came home. His story is the story of World War II compressed into one life. The farm kid who found a way to serve, the pilot who mastered his aircraft and his profession, the leader who inspired those around him, the warrior who faced the enemy with courage and skill, and the tragic death that reminds us war is fundamentally destructive, consuming the best alongside everyone else, making no distinctions between skilled and unskilled, lucky and unlucky, deserving and undeserving. It takes everyone, and gives back only memories and graves and lessons bought with blood. If George Preddy had survived the war, he might have remained in the military like his mentor John C. Meyer, rising through the ranks, commanding fighter wings and air divisions, perhaps reaching flag rank, or he might have left active duty, returned to Greensboro, started a family, found some civilian career that used his skills without requiring him to kill people. We'll never know. What we know is what he accomplished in the time he had, which was more than most people accomplish in lifetimes twice as long. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now and don't forget to subscribe.